What's up, everyone? Tera Roberts here with FantasyPros, bringing you another round of 10 players to cut. Before we get started, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms. Now let's go ahead and jump right in with players to cut in 12 and 14 team leagues. First up, Zach Moss. Let's kick things off with Zach Moss, who coincidentally led off last week's list for obvious reasons. I wanted to kick off this list with Moss because after being a healthy scratch in week 12, Moss was active in week 13 and might be giving fantasy managers false hope, and I do not want to give you false hope that he is an actual usable asset. So let's talk it through. Moss was the beneficiary of an early mishap by Matt Breida. Breida had one carry, mishandled a snap, and never saw another carry. Moss was second on the team with 8 carries, trailing Devin Singletary's 10 carries. The problem is Moss had 21 yards and no touchdowns, and he only added 2 receptions for 12 yards. Active, inactive, splitting carries with Singletary and Breida, or leading the way, it doesn't really matter here with Moss. The Bills' running game is just not productive or enough of a factor to justify rostering Zach Moss. The Bills' upcoming schedule includes a road game against Tampa Bay, a home game against Carolina, and a road game against New England. Those teams are 3rd, 2nd, and 18th against fantasy running backs, and again, he just faced New England, a defense that he only had 33 total yards against. I would look for other options to close out the rest of the season. Next up, Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman continues to be underwhelming in fantasy week after week. He plays with Patrick Mahomes, who is arguably the best quarterback in the NFL. Yet Hardman is ranked 91st in fantasy wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, averaging a meager 3.7 fantasy points per game. He hasn't caught more than 3 receptions or 30 yards in a game over his last 4 games. That's just plain rough. Hardman was a big mistake for the Chiefs. They used a 56th pick in the 2019 NFL draft to take him. The wide receivers they could have had instead are DK Metcalf, Deontay Johnson, and Terry McLaurin, 59, 66, and 76 picks. They also could have had Hunter Renfrow, the 149th pick, if they had just waited and drafted a wide receiver later in the draft. The Chiefs will likely be in the market for a starting wide receiver in the 2022 offseason, as Hardman just hasn't shown the ability to be a viable NFL fantasy receiver, even with an elite quarterback under center. I would look in another direction for the remainder of the season. Just because the Chiefs are stuck with him in 2021 does not mean that you have to be. There's no good reason that he's rostered in 39% of Yahoo leagues and 30% of ESPN leagues. Let him go. Next up, Tim Patrick. There are too many good receivers in Denver and not enough good quarterbacks to feed them the ball consistently. Tim Patrick has the talent and he sure did get paid for it, but he's only had 7.9 fantasy points over his last 3 games, making him the 107th ranked fantasy wide receiver over that time period. The Detroit Lions are 28th against fantasy wide receivers over the past 5 weeks. That matchup is good, but not good enough for me to justify rostering him. Sadly, he's better off on waivers right now. Next up, Alex Collins. Alex Collins was on the list last week as a player to cut in shallow leagues, and look, he's been promoted and called up. Now he is on the cut list for deep leagues. Any and every league, just go ahead and cut him. Collins was inactive in week 13, and the Seahawks didn't really miss him. They tallied 27 carries for 146 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, that total is a little misleading. Travis Homer had a 73-yard touchdown run, so yet again, outside of one big play, this backfield just was a huge disappointment. But if you're gonna roster someone in that disappointment, it's not Alex Collins. Even when Collins returns from injury, Rashad Penny, Adrian Peterson, and Travis Homer are all going to see some level of carries. There's not a lead running back in this offense, and the Seahawks are just going to continue to ride the hot hand, and it's very possible that no running back sees more than 10 carries in a game the rest of the way. I would look for other options other than Collins, even in a great road matchup against Houston. Next up, Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan has averaged only 11.12 fantasy points over his last 6 games. He is officially in that Baker Mayfield and Trevor Lawrence fantasy range. That's not good company. The offense just hasn't been right since Calvin Ridley stepped away from the game back in Week 7. Matt Ryan was averaging 18.55 fantasy points per game in his first 6 games of the season, compared to 11.12 fantasy points averaged since Ridley has left. Their offense as a whole is just averaging 13.5 points per game in those 6 games. Ryan has road games against Carolina and San Francisco, followed by a home game against Detroit, and then a road game against Buffalo. Those teams are 3rd, 9th, 17th, and 1st against fantasy quarterbacks over the past 4 weeks. I'm not sure that a home game against Detroit is enough to justify holding on to one of the league's worst fantasy quarterbacks over the past 6 weeks. It's not like anyone else will be scrambling off to the waivers to go ahead and pick him up as soon as you drop him. I would just look for other streaming options. Next up, Jared Cook. I get the appeal of going with Jared Cook this week with the possibility of both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams being out. As of the filming of this video, we don't know for sure on either one of them, though it's leaning towards Allen being the one that will likely miss this week's game. But I think it's a stretch to think that those targets will shift over to Cook enough to make you feel comfortable enough to start him. Other receiving options will likely step up, and Eckler is a prime candidate to benefit as well. Last week, he caught 3 of his 4 targets for 29 yards against the Cincinnati Bengals. The problem is that Cook continues to split too much time with Donald Parham. They've seen an equal number of targets in 2 of their last 3 games. Cook is a touchdown-dependent tight end that has scored 1 touchdown in his last 6 games. I would look for other options ahead of their matchups with the Giants, Chiefs, Texans, and Broncos. Those teams are 16th, 5th, 4th, and 9th against fantasy tight ends. The chances of Cook suddenly finding the end zone regularly at the end of the season are not good. Moving on to shallow leagues, and first up is Ryan Tannehill. Ryan Tannehill has only averaged 14 fantasy points per game over his last 4 games, and his next 4 opponents are the Jacksonville Jaguars, Pittsburgh Steelers, San Francisco 49ers, and the Miami Dolphins. Those teams are 8th, 26th, 9th, and 5th against fantasy quarterbacks. But even in a game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's very possible that the Titans could just stay committed to the run, because the Steelers are equally terrible against the run. But are we really holding on to Tannehill in shallow leagues, waiting for one matchup against Pittsburgh? If you have the room, okay. But with so much talent on bye this week, if you need to drop him to add someone else on waivers, just go ahead and do it. Surely we can find you a better streaming option next week. In deeper leagues, there could still be hope that Julio Jones could help turn things around for Ryan Tannehill, but in a shallow league, I think that the combination of limited weapons and a tough schedule makes it problematic to hold on to Tannehill for the fantasy playoffs. There are just going to be better streaming options available in shallow leagues. Next up, Nyheim Hines. In deeper leagues, Hines is going to have value because he's a handcuff to Jonathan Taylor. Ask Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, and Alvin Kamara fantasy managers how it feels to be without their best fantasy player and no handcuff. If anything were to happen to Jonathan Taylor, Hines would instantly have fantasy value. The problem in shallow leagues is that the fantasy scores are higher, and Hines is a dead roster spot at this point. Hines is only averaging 7.1 fantasy points in his last 4 games, and Deion Jackson had more carries than Hines in garbage time last week. Jackson finished with 6 carries for 19 yards and a touchdown, so unless Hines is your handcuff and you can afford a dead roster spot, he's someone that can be cut loose in a shallow league. Next up, Marvin Jones. You know that things are not working out for Marvin Jones in 2021 when Laquan Treadwell has 5 targets, 4 receptions, and 62 yards. And Jones has 3 targets, 2 receptions, and 11 yards. That's exactly what happened on Sunday in a 37-7 loss to the Los Angeles Rams. I fully blame Urban Meyer for every single thing that is happening in that Jacksonville offense, but Jones is just not a viable fantasy option when he is 5th in targets in one of the worst passing offenses in the NFL. He just doesn't need to be rostered for the remainder of the season. And finally, Hunter Henry. With Hunter Henry, I'm not even going to hold Monday night's game against him. Every pass catcher gets a pass on that one, but putting aside Week 13, Weeks 11 and 12 weren't pretty either. Touchdown-dependent tight ends are not necessarily a bad thing in deep fantasy leagues as long as they are producing, and Henry does have 7 of those. but he has failed to find the end zone since week 10, and Jonnu Smith is becoming a bit of a factor again. The Patriots have a bye week, followed by games against the Indianapolis Colts, Buffalo Bills, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Miami Dolphins to close out the season. Those teams are 27th, 2nd, 6th, and 11th against fantasy tight ends over the past 5 weeks. In shallow leagues, Henry doesn't really have enough upside to warrant holding on to him through the bye week to stream against those teams. Unless you have a roster spot to carry Henry through the bye week to play against Indianapolis, I wouldn't waste the roster spot on him. He's just not scoring as much as of late, and other than week 15, he doesn't have a lot of upside in the fantasy playoffs. And that wraps things up for this week's Players to Cut. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe to FantasyPros across all platforms, and come back next week for another round of 10 Players to Cut.